Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to review 2 books on pigeons. Yes, you heard me correctly, 2 books on the humble pigeon. Some love the bird, some really don't, and I guess that's fitting for this video because one of these books I loved, and the other one, let's just say I didn't. But let's start off by talking about the book that I loved, because for me, that's a whole lot more fun to talk about. That first book is called Homing, On Pigeons, Dwelling, and Why We Return by John Day. This book was published in 2019 by John Murray, which is owned by Hachette UK, and the paperback copy that I read of this book and purchased with my own money comes in at 255 pages. This book tells the author's story of first learning about homing pigeons, then learning more about them, starting to keep them himself, and then eventually learning how to race them and then starting to race them. And the whole time he's telling that story throughout the book, he's also having a number of different discussions about the concept of home. This is fitting because pigeons are seen as homely creatures in both the positive and negative senses of that word. I have heard them called winged rats before, and to give you any kind of an idea of how much people can sometimes detest these birds, it sometimes seems like anyone caught feeding pigeons in a park or in an urban area, they're seen as very sad and lonely if they're stooping so low as to associate with pigeons. We see them as urban creatures now because they've learned to live alongside humans in urban areas in a very sophisticated way, if you think about it, but also they're tied to the concept of home, at least partially because of their very finely tuned, yet still not fully understood homing instinct, or their ability to navigate back to their home roost from basically anywhere. It's because of this skill, and I guess in spite of their negative reputation, that people have been keeping pigeons and racing pigeons for a very long time. In this book, the author gives a little bit of a history of pigeon fanciers and pigeon racing, and how the people who have traditionally kept and raced these birds have been working class people. And there's this really interesting juxtaposition that I don't think he actually brings up in the book. I don't recall him bringing it up, but that I definitely noticed. There's this juxtaposition of pigeon racing and then falconry, which has historically been tied to the upper classes. And so I find it rather interesting that it was none other than Helen Macdonald, author of H is for Hawk, probably my favorite nonfiction book ever. She was the one who got me interested in this book because she reviewed it for the TLS. After I read that review and heard her talk about it on the TLS's podcast, I knew I had to get to it because she spoke so highly of this book. And now, having read this book, I am right there with her because I sank into this book like a worn-in, sinfully comfortable easy chair. Most of the chapters within this book are titled after something to do with the concept of home, and then the discussion within the chapter blends this author's story of his life and his pigeons with these really well-composed and engaging musings about the idea of home, which often involves citing different authors, psychologists, philosophers. I mean, he's really done his homework. So at the beginning of the book, he discusses the development of even just the idea of a home, when people stopped moving around so much and really settled down in one place, considering one place their home, and how at that point, life started to turn inward, and how that facilitated the development of works of art like the novel, which explored the interior in both the physical and figurative senses. He talks about home as our central anchoring point. It's our place from which we go out into the world, and we can only know what home means to us by exiting it at certain points. He talks about how home helps us know what the outside world is. It gives us a map because we first know our homes and then we know the rest of the world. He talks about that knowing of the rest of the world and how there's both comfort in it, but also a little bit of spoiled magic. But he also talks about how homes have the capacity to isolate and confine us, how they can be a retreat away from the world, but how they can also be a cage. This is the second book that I'm reviewing just so far this year in 2021 that has accidentally hit the mark so hard because at the time I'm filming this anyway, we've been dealing with the novel coronavirus COVID-19 situation for just shy of a year here in the United States. I know it started at different times in different places throughout the world, but we started really hearing about it and being recommended to stay home in early March of 2020. So it's been almost a year. And because of those recommendations to stay home, I have spent more time at home over the past year than I ever have before. And truly, as important as home was to me before, it certainly means a whole lot more to me now, in both positive and negative ways. Because when this all got started and we were advised to stay home, it was so easy for an introverted book lover like myself to just go into my little cocoon here with all my books and just stay away from everyone. But then as the situation has gone on and on and on, my feelings of being trapped have really intensified. The author wrote this book and then published this book well in advance of all of this happening, so there's no way he could have predicted that this book and all the different angles he took on such a simple yet loaded topic as the idea of home would end up being so weighty and important because of events that happened after this book's publication. But even though this book accidentally took on what became a very loaded topic, reading it is in no way distressing. I don't mean to imply that. It's actually so comforting. And really, it's covertly sophisticated. Reading this book felt like hanging out with a super smart friend who just happens to know a whole bunch of things and who's making all these references to different theories and works of art, but it's never done in a pretentious way. You never feel like you're being spoken down to. It's like you've spent a great night with this friend, you've had a wonderful time, and you come away from the whole thing feeling smarter. I only wish this book had been longer, and I don't say that because I feel like it needed to be longer in order to be successful, but that I needed it to be longer because I was not ready to say goodbye to this book when I was getting ready to finish it. And that's always the mark of a book that I go on to love and think of fondly as time goes on. If I have trouble parting from it, you know I loved it. I think I would have still loved this book if I had read it earlier, even if it didn't hit perfectly because of global circumstances. But that added element to it made it a slam dunk. Reading this book felt like speaking with someone who just got my increasingly complex relationship with home over the past year. It felt like someone got that, saw that, understood that, and then gave me a hug. I don't think I could have loved this book more. However, the second and final book that I'm going to discuss in today's video, I could have loved more. That book is Flight of the Diamond Smugglers, A Tale of Pigeons, Obsession, and Greed Along Coastal South Africa by Matthew Gavin Frank. This book was published in 2021 by Live Right, which is an imprint of W.W. Norton. The hardcover of this book comes in at 224 pages. However, I read a free e-copy of this book that I received for reviewing purposes through NetGalley. This is ostensibly the story of how workers in diamond mines in South Africa use trained homing pigeons, or carrier pigeons, to smuggle diamonds out of the mines when they're working. But really, this is much more of the story of the diamond mining industry in South Africa. More specifically, it's the story of the company De Beers. The author gives the company's history, more or less. He discusses their practices, talks about the mineral rights they have, how they treat their employees, how they deal with smuggling, and how they're trying to restore areas that have been mined and are now depleted. We meet people from all the different sides of this story, so we do meet one mine worker who admits that he smuggles things. Why he's talking to this author, I don't know, but we meet him and his pet pigeon. We meet different people who work for De Beers in different capacities, including a group of people whose job it is to go out and just shoot these birds, because it's basically mandatory that if you see one of these birds, you have to shoot it. It's required that you shoot it because the company knows what they're used for. Then there's this mythical figure looming over the whole thing, this man by the name of Mr. Lester, who people say works for De Beers and is all-knowing, all-seeing, so he knows when you step out of line. So while the author's initial motivation to write this story are kind of hazy at the start of the book, eventually he does outright state his motivation that he wants to dig into this story and see if Mr. Lester is in fact real. But as the book goes along, you start to understand that what you're reading is a mixture of that story, the story of the pigeons and the diamonds and De Beers, but also it's the story of how the author is collecting that story. So it's this journalistic travel writing approach, but then he's trying to write it as if it's this deep, profound memoir or novel. And if that was his intention, it starts off pretty promising at the beginning of the book because he seems to intend to bring his real life into this story, because he and his partner are in South Africa in the first place because they're there to spread the ashes of their most recently lost child. they keep having pregnancy after pregnancy end in miscarriage. So the author says at the beginning of the book that his interest in the pigeons is because their story is a story of carrying, and his family story, as of that point in time, is a story of miscarrying. So when I read that, after just having finished Homing by John Day, which ties pigeons to a whole different idea, I thought it was a really interesting, albeit heartbreaking topic, and it seemed to promise that there was going to be this really deep, introspective side to this book. But although he does talk about his partner, Louisa, here and there throughout the book, he hints that they're still in pain. He never really goes there, so it felt like the author had made me a promise at the start of the book that he had no intention of keeping. But as disappointing as that was, it wasn't actually the major letdown of this book for me. Besides the fact that I had zero idea what the author was trying to do or say at really any point within this book, what really got me was just how overdone this book was. It was unforgivably overdone. The prose was self-serving and it was flowery. This book needed so many edits. But I suspect that if you took a red pen to this book and gave it the edits that it so desperately needed, you'd be cutting it down to a third of its size. And then it would be the length of a magazine article that it should have been in the first place. Unfortunately, this is a very common thing that I've noticed in a lot of nonfiction books that I've been reading lately, where there's only enough material for an extended magazine article, but they're made into books because they can make money doing that. But there's just not enough material. There's not enough story there. So it ends up being padded and it's just a mess of a book. And it's funny because I've read a lot of books that started off as magazine articles, but they discovered there was more to explore there. There was more story there. So then they turned it into a book. At what point did we start doing things backwards? There was actually one book that did that, went from being a magazine article and then was turned into a book. It was called The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. This book, Flight of the Diamond Smugglers, reminded me so much of that book because they have the whole birds plus thieving thing going on. So I thought I was in for a similar ride. And I really could not have been more wrong. I ended up giving this book 2 stars because I felt like it had some redeeming qualities to it. Sometimes the author would say something in a really interesting way or make a great observation. And I was like, yes, that's it. That's great. But most of the time after he would do that, he just kept talking. And it ended up ruining the mood, sullying the message. This book was just a letdown. Admittedly, I do think it was a little bit harder for me to get along with this book because I read it immediately after I read Homing. And that book is so genuine, it's so understated. You can tell that John Day isn't attempting to inflate his word count, and he isn't interested in being the smartest guy in the room. And I can't say that about this author. I never explicitly set out to make these dual review videos into comparison exercises. I'm really not looking to pit one book against the other, but inevitably one of them ends up coming out on top, and I think you can tell which one that was in this video. I was so disappointed by this book. I really thought I was going to love it. But the whole time, I was just feeling so incredibly bad for the pigeons. They are so mistreated throughout this entire book. I felt bad for the workers who felt like they had to smuggle just so they could get out of the conditions of the mines. I didn't understand why there wasn't a larger discussion of the health impacts of working in these mines. My true takeaway from this book is that the diamond industry is just as exploitative in every sense of the word as I thought it was, and that I'm really glad I don't own one. It's fake. I wish I had better news about this one, honestly. I much prefer to give rave reviews, but this one was more rough than diamond in the rough. But those were my thoughts on 2 books that deal with the unloved bird, the pigeon. If you have any comments or questions about either one of these books or about anything in general, you can feel free to leave those in the comment section below. If you would like to keep up with what I'm reading, you can find me on social media. The links to my profiles will be in the description box below. And also in that description box below, there will be a further reading section where I will recommend some books you might enjoy if you really liked either one of these. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.